Hello and welcome to Things We Said Today, the weekly podcast about all things Beatles, past, present, and if we happen to know about something coming up in the future, we'll talk about it. I'm Allan Kozin, and I'm joined by Ken Michaels, who you may also know as the host of the syndicated radio show Every Little Thing. Hello, Ken.
Hey, Allan. Hi, everybody.
And Steve Marinucci, who you know as the Beatles Examiner, the writer of the Beatles Examiner column and many other Examiner columns. And hello, Steve. How are you doing?
Hi, Allan. Hello, everyone.
And Al Sussman, a longtime contributor to Beatle Fan magazine and now executive editor of Beatle Fan magazine. Hello, Al.
Hi, Allan. Hello there, everybody.
So we have a lot to discuss this week because our main topic is the Beatles 1 and Beatles 1 Plus. But we should also begin by recognizing the passing of Andy White, who, as I'm sure you all know, played drums on the September 11th, 1962 session at which the second version of Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You and an early version of Please Please Me were recorded, and so has a sort of important place in Beatles history. And he died on Monday at his home in Caldwell, New Jersey. I found out, I wrote his obituary for the New York Times and was asking his wife about some of the other things that he worked on, and a lot of the obits mentioned Tom Jones, It's Not Unusual, and some other things. But what I didn't know was that he also played drums on I'm Henry VIII I Am, the Herman's Hermit song, which of course begins with drums. So,
Wow.
yeah, he did a lot of work. He toured with Marlene Dietrich and Steve.
I heard that he had done I'd heard that he'd done Herman's Hermits. I can't remember whether I'd heard it was that song, but in researching what I wrote up, the name Herman's Hermits did come across.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And in a way, it's a pity Tom Frangione, our sometimes co-host, is not with us because he knew him. And there is video on YouTube of him introducing a performance of Love Me Do with the Smithereens playing and Andy White on drums. And Andy White's last recording was P.S. I Love You with the Smithereens. And for historical verisimilitude, Dennis Diken, the Smithereens drummer, stood aside and played maracas while Andy White played drums. So,
yeah. How cool.
Yeah.
Nice of him. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyone have any observations about Andy White before we move on to one?
Well, I was going to say, it's funny how when people are putting stuff together, there are all sorts of labels, and I actually saw a Fifth Beatle label put on Andy White yesterday, and I kind of went anyway, but it's sad that he got so much recognition after his passing, and not before, and the whole situation. What was funny was when I was doing the research, I was looking up, the recording session and how much Ringo was really upset about that. And somebody made the comment, I think on my Facebook page yesterday, I wonder if Ringo will post a statement. I kind of doubt it, because apparently he was not pleased that George Martin asked him to step aside.
Yeah.
So
now, as a segue, one of the interesting things about the one set is they sometimes, in several cases, use different audio for the video and the CDs, depending what they were using as visuals. And as it turns out, the CD has the take of Love Me Do with Andy White, but the video has the audio of the single with Ringo. playing drums. So actually in that set, you get both versions. So that's actually a nice touch. Yeah.
In fact, ironically
Does
enough, Tom brought that up to me the other day.
Does anyone know why the decision was made that when the British single came out, it was the one with Ringo on it? If George Martin wasn't so, pleased with Ringo's performance as a drummer, or he wasn't sure of him and his ability, why did they choose for the British single to be the one with Ringo on it?
No one has ever gotten to the bottom of that so far as I know. It's obviously something Mark Lewisohn's looked into, and I don't think he's been able to get a decisive answer. Also, as you know, once the Please Please Me album came out with the Andy White take on it, they ended up switching out the single, so later pressings of the British single were also Andy White. It was really just the earliest pressings had Ringo. So it may have been a mistake. But, they're both, I like both of those versions. It's not just that one has a tambourine and one doesn't. There's also a different kind of bass line. In fact, it's easier for me to tell which is which because of the bass line. Because on the one with Ringo, Paul does a slightly sort of a dotted rhythm, almost it's just like boom, boom, ba boom, ba boom, and he leaves out the extra note on the one with Andy White. It's just boom, boom, boom. So those are things you can listen for to determine which is which when you're hearing them. Of course, the tambourine does make a difference. The tambourine makes a difference, but the acoustic guitars are sort of jangly too, so things sort of meld together in a certain way.
You can tell from the vocals too.
Yeah, that's right. A little more nervous in the earlier one, I think. Yeah. So let's talk about one in its various iterations and One Plus. I would say probably for the sake of concision, we're probably going to be talking mostly about One Plus, the version that has the CD and 2 DVDs or Blu-rays, because that has the most stuff. Wait for Al's train to go.
Yes, waiting for the northern and southern line to get past the door here.
Okay. So, shall we start with Al? Just for your general impressions about the set?
Yeah, it's very well put together. Just in general, certainly on the CD, the one CD, the one CD, the remastered, remixed one CD. The overall sound is much brighter. The first 3 tracks, obviously, there's not much you can do with that. But other than the whether or not From Me to You should be in stereo.
Yeah.
But several of the tracks just sound really outstanding. I Feel Fine, for instance, sounds much better balanced than I ever recall it. And also, I have a question on All You Need Is Love. Now, that sounds about as good as any version of it I've ever heard. Is that a new remix, or is that perhaps the version that Giles Martin did for Love, or the version that was done for the Yellow Submarine song track?
It's a new version. The ones, I compared some of the song track ones. I don't know if I compared that one. I compared some of the others, Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby, for instance, and they're definitely different mixes. I think that the Peter Cobbin who mixed the song track one was a little more adventurous, whereas Giles Martin wanted to more or less reproduce what his father did. So, for instance, on Yellow Submarine, where John comes in with the funny voices, and there are other voices, Captain, that kind of thing. What Peter Cobbin did is he spread those across the 2 speakers, so you've got the voices coming in different places. Giles Martin did pretty much what his father did, which was have them all on one side. So anyway, continue, Al. If you I'm sure you have more to say.
If there was anything, a shortcoming, I was slightly disappointed that they didn't get a little more adventurous with those mixes. I really thought that they would.
Yeah.
Especially since they went to
Yeah.
the point of telling everybody it was remixed.
Yeah.
I expected some major changes, and there, especially with the CD, there wasn't. I mean, the DVD had, I think, some more changes. Although, I mean, there are some really nice tracks on the CD. The middle tracks, Paperback Writer, and those.
Yes.
That sounds. I mean, I
Absolutely.
did A/B comparisons on that in the days before it was released, before I wrote up my review, and I was completely blown away. It was. I mean, they sounded fantastic. They really did.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've always felt, and absolutely, and this album just confirms it for me, is that I Want to Hold Your Hand should never be heard in stereo. It just, I mean,
Really?
the power of that, it should always be heard in mono. Breaking it up into stereo just really makes, to paraphrase, John Lennon about the stereo version of Revolution, it turns it into ice cream.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily agree with that, Al. Because I like the stereo version, but
Yeah, I like the stereo version too. I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do agree with John's comments about Revolution. Revolution has a lot more guts and
Yeah.
more balls to it in mono. That's the way to listen to it.
Mm-hmm. And Paperback Writer did too,
maybe,
but the remix sort of approximates a lot of the mono power that had been lost in the stereo Paperback Writer.
Yes.
So I think they fixed some things.
Yeah,
they did a wonderful job with that.
Yeah. So Ken, what about you?
Overall, I'm totally blown away by everything. But just talking about the CD alone, I wasn't expecting something drastic. I thought there'd be some slight changes, and that's pretty much what we've gotten here. When I read John Martin's comments about this, he pretty much said he was kind of striving for more of a mono sound while keeping it stereo. And I could see what he was saying there, especially with the difference in Paperback Writer in the intro. In the stereo, isn't the vocals in one channel, but now it's centered in both. There's more power that way in the song. Yeah. So I certainly think Paperback Writer has more guts to it, more meat to it this way. Definitely feel more bass and drums, which is what I expected. When you're trying to make songs of the past, recordings of the past more contemporary, you have to beef up the drums a little bit and the bass. And I think that you can certainly sense that in this collection. I'm very pleased. I've read your comments, Allan, which has influenced the way that I've been thinking. But I certainly, the first thing that leaped out at me was that I did hear more of the piano in Penny Lane in the quarter notes that are being played by Paul in the song. It's, I think you worded it the staccato, playing of that, a little bit more of the flute in the very beginning. But the thing is, whenever you're dealing with remixes, and I always like to hold off for a while before I make comments, because depending upon what system you're playing it in, you can hear something different in each system.
Right.
And the first time that I listened to the CD, I listened in my headphones. I guarantee you, when I play this in my living room, in my stereo, I'll probably hear something different altogether. So, and the same thing if you play it in the car. There's all sorts of nuances that you'll pick up in certain songs that maybe you didn't hear the first time around. But I wasn't expecting anything drastic. I think if there were drastic mixes, a lot of people would complain about it. Too many people.
Right.
Even the ones who are more adventurous and more open-minded to it would still think, you're going a little bit too far here. It's one thing when you're playing around with it, like with the soundtrack of Love. That had a purpose. There are reasons why they mix songs together in that way.
Right, and so people gave them leeway because that was the deal,
Right, but these were really tastefully done.
Yeah.
There's some slight changes, but not enough to make people cry out, "Oh, what have you done here?" So I like what was done.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased with the CD.
And you mentioned the bass and the drums, and as we all know, I mean, the Beatles complained even during the Beatles era that they weren't getting the bass and drum sound that they wanted, and they would bring in R&B records from America to EMI and say, why can't you cut them like this? So this is correcting what they always have said was a deficit. And I don't know about you guys, but, just in talking to people about this release, a number of people have said, now hearing these remixes, now I see the point of Ringo. Now I see why Ringo was regarded as, by the rest of them as such a great drummer. And I think these have done Ringo really a service without turning it into a drum record with guitar backing, I think it's brought him and Paul up in the mix to a much more sort of realistic place. So yeah, I mean,
well, that's what they said about the 2009 remasters. That's what they were saying.
Yeah.
Everybody was pointing to the drumming. You could finally hear Ringo's drumming.
Yeah.
And I always remember George Harrison talking about Rubber Soul in particular, and that Ringo's drums used to sound like tin cans. But you listen to the 2009 remasters, and all of his drumming really shines. So yeah, he certainly benefits, as does Paul, with these remixes and the remasters.
So, Steve, your general feeling?
My general feeling, I'm happy with the remixes. I think that, like I said, I kind of was expecting more. I was expecting they would go a little further, since kind of more on what they did with Songtrack. But the upgrades on say like Paperback Writer and Rain and those things were just absolutely awesome. Like I said, I did some A/B comparisons in the days before it came out on the street, before I wrote my review, and just hearing those differences was just absolutely uplifting. It was really, really, really good. I was really pleased.
Yeah.
If anything, I wish they had made video mix. They had put some of the songs that weren't in the original 27 on CD.
Right.
As a bonus CD for the people who bought the deluxe.
Right.
Like Real Love and Free as a Bird. I'm sorry that the only way that you're going to get MP3 mixes of those, or I should say audio mixes of those now, is from bootlegs, because they didn't bother to do that. And
Yeah.
I think that was one thing they missed. I think the video quality is tremendous, and I know there's been some grousing about that, especially with the Blu-rays. We were talking about this before we got started, and I'm sitting here while we're sitting here talking and doing this. I'm sitting here watching the Blu-ray, my Blu-ray, and it looks fine. I mean, again, thinking about these are, all, in some cases, over 50 years old. The quality was not made for, in many cases, for this kind of of being upgraded and being archived this way 50 years later.
Right.
One big exception to that rule, and I wrote about this before the release came out, was 8 days a week.
Gosh. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That looks so damn
Do you
good.
think they're just teasing us with that about,
Yes.
yes, we have Shea Stadium and it looks like this, and you can't have it yet until we say. Yeah,
Right.
it does
And
look
absolutely.
beautiful.
And the other thing that looks good is the Within You Without You. That looked crystal clear on the Blu-ray, and I couldn't believe. I mean, we don't have Blu-rays of the Love stuff yet, but I mean, that looked so good. When I remember, that was another upgrade, and the Let It Be stuff looks really good too. And I've got, as we all do, how many versions of the movie, and I did a side-by-side comparison of that, and the Let It Be clips look great. I mean, they don't look perfect. I don't think the graininess is ever going to go away, unfortunately, on that. Even though, we'd all love it to, but I mean, it looks really good.
They do.
It looks really, the Let It Be clips in this look sharper than I think we've ever seen them.
Yeah.
Even the bootlegs they even said were fantastic look great. I'm looking right now at the animated menus. I think that's one thing that kind of ticked me off a little bit was the animated menus because they took so much time, even though they don't take that much time. But after watching them for several days and looking at the, how funny they were in the Hey Jules with the Hey
Yeah.
Jude,
Yeah.
I actually
Yeah.
appreciated that a little more.
Hmm.
So I'm not complaining too much about that. But I mean, overall, this is fantastic. I mean, I was, I don't mean to put myself out there, but I mean, this was one thing that I'd been talking and asking for years, and now that it's here, I'm really really glad. And for whatever shortcomings, it's not exactly the way I would have done it, but I'm not going to complain. I'm really
Yeah.
not.
There are a couple of anomalies maybe we should mention. First of all, the video discs have 5.1 surround sound, and the mixes are different. I mean, obviously, by definition, they're going to be different. But for instance, in one case, A Day in the Life, in surround sound, it is a remix of A Day in the Life as we know it, but in stereo, it is the Love mix of A Day in the Life, which is one of the more straightforward mixes on Love, except that they remove the second piano part. And it's most telling in the build up to when the vocal comes in, because the last piano chord before the vocal starts is not in the piano part that they left there, but is in the one that they didn't include. And that strikes me as perhaps a mistake. I don't know whether they were just trying to save the effort of remixing again, because they had just done a remix for the Love album, and maybe they thought that it was more straightforward than it actually was. But whatever the reason, that's an oddity. Another thing, on the CD, 8 days a week, there actually is a kind of editing mistake there. Doesn't bother me particularly, but it's just sort of interesting. 8 days a week was basically take 13, except at the end, the percussion got a little bit out of sync and the guitars were a little bit out of tune, and so they made an edit piece which was take 15, and they added the edit piece on just as the outro of the song. Giles appears to have overlooked that, or forgotten or missed it or something, but he didn't add on the take 15 edit piece. So the good news is that we now have take 13 complete, which we didn't have before. And the bad news is, if you want it to be the exact, a remix of the exact song as we had it, well, it's missing the take 15 edit piece. I would say that 9 3/4 out of 10 people won't even notice it.
Right.
But it's just
including us.
Yes.
A reason not to throw away your 2009 remaster.
Yeah, I mean, the slight out-of-tuneness in the guitars doesn't really bother me. I know a couple of people it does bother, and there's so much going on there to say that the percussion's out of sync is okay, maybe. But George Martin and the Beatles must have heard it at the time, or they wouldn't have done the edit. But I thought the record sounded great, and I'm actually just as happy to have a full take that we didn't previously have. But,
Right.
It's just one of these things that, like, a project like this is always going to yield some extra stuff that is perhaps unplanned, and that's one.
And you don't forget the Real Love change.
Oh, yes, the Real Love change. Well, we've had a long debate about this, partly because we were talking about different things. I thought you were talking about the
Right.
solo being different, which sounds the same to me, but a lot of the little bits of George's guitar are different. And I think there is, in Free as a Bird as well, there's a section where his vocal's different, where in one he says the life that we once knew, and the other he says the love that we once knew. So you've got some changes there too. And as you said, there should be a CD version of that, but but there isn't.
Why
Yeah.
would they do that? Why would they let it go out that way? As soon
you
as
know-
I watched the Freeze Bird video, I noticed that instantly. George's vocal is different.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's the same. It's the same logic that was used in the changes in the anthology. that drove everybody nuts. And I mean, the only thing I can pin it down to, and Alan, tell me if you think this is correct, is it's their music and they can do what they want with it. I
Sure.
mean,
Mhm.
I mean, that's what. I mean, I know the Yes It Is. What they did with Yes It Is on Anthology just knocked me. I really was not in favor of that at all. Really didn't like it.
You
Splicing
mean
all those.
crossfading into the release
Mhm.
version? You mean, or what?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, doing that instead of just using the whole outtake that we'd had, that had been floating around. I mean, why do something like that?
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, it's nice to have these little changes.
Mhm.
It gives us something to, to add to the canon, to say,
That's right.
look what we've got here, So
Not only that, but in Real Love, at the very beginning, John's vocals are more processed. They're kind of
Yes.
buried more than on the
Mhm.
record.
Yeah.
So I noticed that instantly.
what's really about those two, about Real Love and Free as a Bird, is that, if you look at it from the fact that it was an artificial record to begin with, and we have outtakes that we've never heard before stuck in there now, even as small as they are. They've created their own little, alternate version. And I think that's actually that's a good thing. But
Mhm.
I'll tell you, and Ken will acknowledge this. I called him the night I got the disc, and I was sitting there watching it, and I was literally my voice was almost shaking because I couldn't believe they'd actually made changes in these songs.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it was amazing. But I'm not gonna, it's not. I know there are people that will say, "Why did they bother? Why did they change it? Why did they change it?" I think the more the merrier, as far as we have the original versions. The thing is, though, that with the 2009 remaster, they've said that the new one is replacing the old one. So, if you don't have them, don't let them go. If you haven't got them, go out and get them if that really matters to you.
Well, I have a feeling that it's certainly in the case of Free as a Bird and Real Love, since they're not technically, I mean, obviously all four Beatles are on it, but, they're not technically Beatles recordings.
Mm-hmm.
So, they're not part of the canon, so to speak. So there's probably...
What was that?
I think
Somebody's phone.
That's the phone.
I think John and George are responding to you on that comment.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, really, you could argue that there is much of the Beatles canon as I Me Mine is that John didn't turn up to record. So
Yeah.
here they at least had a
no,
recording of him.
I totally disagree with that. I think it's definitely very much a part of the Beatles canon.
Oh yeah.
There's so many songs that the Beatles released that only had 1, 2, or 3 Beatles in them.
Well,
Right.
So
I'm talking about the 1962 to 1969, the EMI, canon.
Right, okay.
Not the Decca audition tapes, not the Tony Sheridan sessions, not Free as a Bird and Real Love. I'm talking about the actual EMI canon.
Right.
They're not part of that, so there's probably less sensitivity about making changes in those two songs than there might be making changes in the things that are within the canon itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, should we clarify for people the argument on behalf of remixes in any case because of the original recording process and what remixing allows?
Mm-hmm.
I think, as probably everyone who listens to this read Mark Lewison's recording sessions book. And as you know,
Sure.
most of the time that they recorded, they were using 4-track. And 4-track very quickly got to be way too few tracks for them. And so their solution was to do what they called reduction mixes, which was copying the tape to another 4-track tape, mixing a few of the tracks together as they went along. So every time they did that, you got, even on really good equipment like they were using, you got some generation loss, which means very subtle distortions and dulling of the instrumental and vocal textures, a little bit of tape hiss added, stuff like that. Now, some of these tracks, something like Penny Lane, had several reduction mixes along the way. And then at the end, you have a 4-track tape with everything on it they want on it, and you make a mono and stereo master, which is yet another copy. So for a lot of these recordings, by the time we got it, it was, maybe 4th, 5th, 6th generation, depending, because in addition, once they had the master, it's not like EMI sent the actual master to every country to be cut. They made a copy of the master too. So you're down yet another generation. In the 90s, EMI went back to its archive and got the session tapes, and they transferred everything digitally, including the tapes as they were before the reduction mixes were made. And that means, in effect, they have a first-generation copy of every single instrumental line that they can use for these mixes, instead of the 3rd, 4th, or 5th generation that we got. Plus, it allows for some flexibility. I mean, you're making your first reduction mix, and you say combine a couple of vocal tracks and a guitar track and and a piano. When you get a couple of stages away, you might very well say, I wish the piano was a little bit louder, or I wish the vocals could be put on alternate channels. It's too late. It's the reduction mix. Everything's been recorded around it. You can't change it. But now you can, Now they have both quality and flexibility that they didn't have available to them in the 1960s. And so, just with that in mind, and even if you're going to do it as conservatively as Giles Martin did, just for that, I would love to hear remixes of the entire catalog. Just for the generation loss, issue, because it's more like you're in the room with the Beatles. You're hearing the sounds as they were recorded, and that's why also the bass and drums sound so good, So,
if they ever get around to doing the Blu-ray thing that we've been hearing that they'll do, maybe that will, maybe that will all come about.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the selling point with the remasters, and as good as the remasters were, there's still further they can go further.
Yeah, because with the remasters, you're still dealing with the reduction mixes and all that stuff that happened. You're saving maybe a generation or so, but you're not saving that much.
No.
And this also explains why, when you're getting into more complicated pieces of work, the more layered pieces of work, like what was on Sgt. Pepper, I think the music suffers because of the reduction mixes, because there probably were plenty of them. And if you listen with your headphones, you can hear a lot more hits, and it's a duller sound. I mean, it got better with the 2009 remasters, no doubt about it, but you can certainly tell the difference between simpler productions that required less tracks, and those recordings can tend to be brighter and punchier for that reason. But obviously, if you go back to the original masters, then the sky's the limit. That opens up the doors to enormous possibilities.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's great.
Allan, I've got a question for you. Kind of an audio question from somebody who, obviously over the years, we've all done a fair amount of bootleg collecting. So I'm curious about.
We have?
Well, some of us have.
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
Right, theoretically, yes. Maybe not in reality. On Can't Buy Me Love, those of us who've had copies of Around the Beatles, and have heard and seen that performance of Can't Buy Me Love, the crowd is almost overwhelming, in the audio mix. Here on this clip, there's almost no crowd. So I'm wondering if perhaps they used something that we've had on bootlegs for a number of years, the actual studio recordings that were done before the show.
I think so. I know they have those, and I know that they have, the
Right.
real ones. When I say the real ones, I mean not the bootlegs, and I can tell you why. I know that. Once when I was on a trip to England before the anthology came out, while it was in the works, I was visiting Mark, and he said, "Could you bring the disc of that has that, pre-audience around the Beatles track?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, but why?" And he said, "Well, they don't actually have it." So I brought it over. He called EMI. They sent a messenger on a motorbike and got the disc, copied it, and brought it back. And then I don't know how far after that it was, but he said, "You know what? They don't actually need it because they've located the original tapes of that session." So they have the upgraded thing. I think there were a couple of tracks. Well, "Shout" at least was on the anthology.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's very likely that he used the pre-audience tape in making his mix for the video. I kind of wondered why. It seemed to me, especially if you're going to be making remixes in 5.1 for "Hard Day's Night" and "Can't Buy Me Love," I almost kind of wish that they did what they did with the Yellow Submarine stuff, used some footage from the film, but given us a remix of the studio recordings. Because yes, it's great to see that live "Hard Day's Night" from Paris, but I think they should just release the whole Paris on its own and give it to us that way,
Yeah.
rather than a track at a time. And the same with "Around the Beatles." They should put that out with, maybe a remix soundtrack or not, but whatever. So I kind of wish that they had used the studio recordings of those tracks, perhaps with footage from the film, to make, even if it was making new videos. But that's just my sense. Am I the only one here with surround with 5.1?
I
Yes.
think you are.
So
Yeah.
then I'll just comment a little on that. In a certain way, I found that, I mean, it was great to hear. It's great to be enveloped in the sound. And some of them, like "A Day in the Life" and "Strawberry Fields," you really feel like you're in the middle of it all. But for the most part, the surround mixes pretty much just put ambient sound in the rear speakers. And Giles Martin talked about this, and I think that that's also a bit of the sort of conservative approach of not wanting to change too much. I think a lot of us were sort of hoping that the 5.1 sound would be 5 discrete channels of sound for, among other reasons, it makes it possible to sort of take that sound apart and get again closer to the multi-tracks. But I think there are at least two philosophies of mixing 5.1. One is using the 5 speakers and creating effects all around you, and the other is using it to, as Giles Martin talked about in his BBC interview, the Beatles are in front of you on stage. You don't want the lead guitar coming out of the rear left channel. The problem is a lot of these are studio recordings, so it's not the Beatles on stage. And I'd have loved to feel like I was sitting in the middle of Abbey Road with the lead guitar coming out of the left rear channel. That would have been kind of fun. But, maybe at some point he'll make that kind of mix. He talked about how if he were remixing the White Album, he would go a little wilder. So, but yeah, people have now ripped the 5 channels out of the Blu-ray soundtrack, and if you listen to the rear channels, there's not a lot there but ambience. Having said that, the 3 front channels are often pretty different, and "Real Love" is a good example. The center channel, for instance, in the intro, you just hear the single line piano. You don't hear the harpsichord. You don't hear any. You hear some other backing, but what you hear for a melody is just that one piano line. And so the 2 stereo channels in front are different kind of things. And if you listen to the rear channel, they didn't put George's little guitar fills between lines in the rear at all. Those are just coming out of the front. So you do have some difference, but I think it's not as varied as a lot of people hoped.
Hmm.
Sounds good. I've really enjoyed putting it on in surround and sitting in the middle of the room and feeling, enveloped by it. But I think people wanted it to be a bit more discreet sound. So that's the 5.1 commentary here.
So would you
Yeah.
would you say the Love 5.1 is better than this, basically, Alan?
You mean of the documentary?
No. On the Love DVD, the 5.1 there.
Which 5.1?
Well, didn't they did 5.1 on Love, didn't they?
On the
on the
CD?
on the DVD, didn't they? Am I wrong?
DVD is just a documentary about the love thing, right?
No. When they did the dual release with the CD and the DVD.
It's interesting. I probably didn't
Yeah.
have 5.1 at the time and have neglected to take it off the shelf again. So I need to do that.
Yes,
I
you
need
do.
to do that.
Yes, you
I'm
do.
sure it's got much more going on because that was the
Yeah,
kind
because
of mix it was.
The comments I remember hearing at the time was the 5.1 on the Love DVD was fantastic.
Yes. Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that I bought even though I didn't have the equipment, and then I got the equipment and forgot about it. Whoops.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. There's some more Beatling to be done this weekend.
There we go. The documentary doesn't have, as far as I know, doesn't have anything. As far as I know, I mean, if it does, it's really irrelevant because it's all talking anyway, for the most part. Although there is the audio parts to it too. But
Right.
Yeah, you definitely should pull out that DVD and take a look at it.
Oh, yes.
So,
Okay.
Because I remember that all being extracted too. I remember seeing extractions of all of that stuff too.
Right.
So, right, there we go. But they've already extracted the new stuff, eh?
Yeah.
Or I shouldn't say that. I guess we shouldn't say that too loud.
Well, I have a feeling at this point Apple must have known that people would do it. Maybe that's why they made the 5.1 mixes the way they did too.
Well, actually, what was interesting and was the lack of complete previews beforehand. I mean, there were people commenting about iTunes, people, saying, although there were the videos, I mean, there was a lot of stuff that they did not put out beforehand. They kept everybody in suspense, basically.
Yeah.
So that when release day came, it wouldn't all be, it wouldn't all be out there, and it worked. It worked. I think it worked very well. They did, and it's interesting that they did all the video previews that they did because it, even though I did hear comments, especially near the end, if they keep doing this, I'm not going to have to buy it. But I'll tell you, I mean, there was a lot of enthusiasm as witnessed by, the stuff going on in Japan and and even in America. I mean, there was there was quite a lot of enthusiasm.
They made it very exciting. They made it an exciting release that people were waiting for and wanted, and totally the opposite of the one release in 2000. Okay, I bought many copies of it to give to people, but it wasn't that exciting in terms of those of us who have everything many times over. And here, even though we had it many times over, there was something new. The remixes, the video. Even those of us who had the video, we never had it like this.
Exactly.
And they made it an event, and that was a good thing. And yet, from what I hear, they underestimated the market for it. I heard from someone at a retail store that shortly before it came out, they got a call from Universal saying, "Listen, you ordered, X number of discs, and we just can't really supply that. We're short." And the person said, "Wait a minute, you don't understand. People have pre-ordered these. We've promised them for release day." And Universal managed to come up with the numbers that they needed, and they were okay. But it just sort of surprised me. It's like, wait a minute, it's a Beatles release. It's stuff that hasn't been out.
Are you referring to Amazon? You're referring to
No,
Amazon?
no, I'm
Because
not.
I heard a lot of people who ordered on Amazon in Australia
Right.
and even in America.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say a lot here, but I did hear a lot of reports from Australia that
Yeah.
people who pre-ordered through Amazon there did
Right.
not get it
Yeah, I
for at
heard
least a
that too,
week.
but no, this was from someplace else, and
Okay.
it just surprises me that wait a minute, you're a record company, you're putting out Beatles stuff that hasn't been out, and it doesn't occur to you that you need to have a lot of them on hand. What is that?
Yeah, I mean the visual thing, has a built-in I don't know how to say it, attraction, I guess, because of the MTV, situation. And
Hmm.
I mean, that kind of, even though MTV isn't where it is now, I mean, is where it was. Um, I mean, there's still people love visuals, and this stuff, a lot of the general public has not seen. We
Right.
have,
Hmm.
we've
Yeah.
seen it zillions of times over and in lousy quality.
And let's
But
face it, the
when you,
Beatles were very visual guys. There's a lot
hmm
you get
Yeah.
from looking at
Yeah.
the interplay between them, and even just the chemistry of the group. I mean, I've seen these things a
Mhm.
gazillion times, and yet sat there saying, it's interesting how even really early on, Paul was always on. He was the one smiling at the audience.
Yes.
John, not
hmm
particularly. George, a bit less. And just looking at the differences between, there's just so much to watch with the Beatles always. And
hmm
then when they throw in stuff like, oh, let's do Hello Goodbye in our Sergeant Pepper suits. I mean, that's an incredibly visual clip.
hmm
So, and A Day in
yeah.
the Life, the sessions, it's cut very weirdly because it's sort of psychedelic and it's jumping around, and yet
Mhm.
you're seeing the orchestra with its funny noses and masks on. You're seeing McCartney conducting it a little. You're seeing George Martin conduct it. You're getting an awful lot of information from these visuals.
hmm
So, yeah, incredible
Yeah.
attraction.
It's always fascinating. It's fascinating to always watch John and Paul
Hmm.
and how much Paul cracks up because of John in
Yes.
some of these
Hmm.
videos.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
We can work it
just
out.
to see,
Yes.
hmm
yeah.
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 And, you're wondering what's going on during those videos, but there
Yeah.
are times when Paul is trying to contain himself,
Yeah.
hmm
he's smiling and something's going on in his mind that John's, he's playing with him in some way. And then you're trying to figure it out. And at some point, Paul cracks up or something. But yeah, that's the great thing. Like you said, visually, there's so much interplay going on with them. And,
Yeah.
in many ways, we have to be very grateful that at the end of 1965, the Beatles cut 10 videos in one day. And most of those
Yeah.
videos were pretty simple.
Hmm.
I mean, but they're still fun to watch. And then once you get
Mhm.
into the more artsy videos, visually, they are just stunning. And they're in the best quality I've ever seen. I
Yeah.
mean, just going
Mhm.
into Paperback Writer and Rain, the ones from Rain, my God.
Yeah.
I mean, I love
Yeah.
the fact that they put the 3 videos of Rain in there. And I like the third one, the black and white one, just as much as the other two.
hmm
It's
Yeah.
kind of very artsy being black and white. And
Yeah.
the fact that
Mhm.
that was more of a performance video than the other two were. And then once you get into Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, again, very artsy videos. And then you go into Hey Jude and Revolution, which looks stunning.
Yeah.
I mean, such a clear
Yes.
picture as I've never seen before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
Mhm.
apart from all that, there's some emotion tied in since we're all human here. Every time I watch
Sure.
the Something video, I have to obviously acknowledge the fact that there's 8 people in that video and half of them are no
Yeah.
longer here.
Yeah.
hmm
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's a very personal video to see each of the 4
Mhm.
Beatles with their women at the time, their wives at the time.
hmm
So watching that really moves me. But there's a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to you guys because I've watched all the videos and I listened to the CD. The only thing I haven't had time to do is to read the booklet. But maybe you can
Mhm.
answer a few questions, which is of the live performances that they chose. They're all great,
Yeah.
but do you know what the process was behind those? Because obviously there's got to be several videos of From Me to You, I mean, why pick the Royal Variety Performance one of that? Can't Buy Me Love. Why the one from Around the Beatles? There must have been some thought process behind that. And the other question that I have is that for the songs for which they made more than one video, how do you pick which is the best one to put on the first disc? Was it always the first video that they made? Because I love that video of Hello Goodbye where they're all dancing around.
Right.
And you see Paul, together, arm in arm there, dancing.
Right.
I like that one just as much.
Yeah, I like all of
Why
those.
is the first?
Well,
they're
probably
a lot of fun to watch. The two videos of Hey Jude are wonderful. I love the second one just as much as the first.
Yeah. I think in some of those cases they went with what was widely seen at the time. So Hello Goodbye, the Pepper one, was seen on Ed Sullivan.
Right.
And,
Right.
I don't know if this is one of the things you may discover in the booklet, but those videos, Paul McCartney is listed as the director for them.
Right.
Yeah.
However, Something was apparently directed by Neil Aspinall, and it just says directed by the Beatles. So, a funny thing about Something as well is that, those were all obviously filmed separately. There's no scene in there where two Beatles are in the same frame.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
and that's in fact you mentioned the sort of the emotion of knowing that half of those people are gone now, but also
Right.
just the historical standpoint of knowing that video was the necessity of making that video was the fact that for all intents and purposes the group didn't exist by that point.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned From Me to You. I have a feeling I'm sort of doing a quick inventory in my mind. It's very possible that version from the Royal Command Performance may be the only video version of that song that exists now.
Didn't they do it in Washington?
Yeah, they did.
Yes, they did. Yes.
But there aren't many.
the
You're
one-
right. There are very few.
The one
Yeah.
the one choice that I was surprised was with Yesterday they used the Ed Sullivan version instead of the
Blackpool.
and now
Yeah.
Opportunity Knocks. That
Yeah.
would have been the one to use. Why didn't they use that one? That was so
Well,
cute.
except that Paul is obviously very nervous
Mhm.
in that one. You
True.
can tell.
True.
So I guess they feel that the Sullivan performance is a more polished one.
Mhm.
Yeah, it could
And
be.
also in the Paperback Writer Rain videos, Paul's tooth, is very
Right.
Oh, yeah.
noticeable in all of those. And I asked Michael Lindsay Hogg, I said, did you guys talk about that or was there any discussion? And he said no, they just did it. And the other thing I asked him was about the Shooby-Doo vocals on Revolution. I said, did they tell you about that? He said, no, that was just a nice surprise.
Hmm.
So it was completely improvisational.
He didn't say we have
Sorry.
just met Mr. Campbell. Sorry.
Yeah,
Little Paul is dead thing going on,
yeah, I see that.
Cute.
I
Yeah.
got it.
Mm.
I was just going to say that, when you watch Revolution right now, the video, it is just it's such a heavy record, the
Yeah,
video
it's
version.
killer.
It's great. And the first thing I noticed when they leaked the video online was how much the drums were beefed up.
Yeah.
Especially early on. And my God, they're rocking on that version. I'm starting to like that version better than the studio one that we've come to know all these years. But it's so great. And another thing I wanted to mention was it's a nice surprise that they included the introduction for Paperback Writer and Rain that was given to Ed Sullivan.
Ed Sullivan, yeah.
Right.
In there.
And the David Frost,
Oh,
introduction,
intro,
too.
sure.
That was
Yeah.
cool
Yeah.
too. I like that.
And of course,
I
with
like
the
that.
Sullivan
Yeah.
intro to Paperback Writer, you see Paul holding up the negatives for the Butcher cover.
Butcher cover. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Matter of fact, on Hey Jude, I have another question for you, Alan. On the 5.1 mix of the video, now on the the regular sound, it sounds as if, because we've always known that basically Paul was singing over the record, including his own vocal.
Right.
Through most of that performance, and yet on the these versions, especially the one on the first disc, at least on the verses, the record vocal is not there. He's not singing harmony basically with his own voice. Although on the choruses he is.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know what they used really.
Yeah.
What do you guys think of the commentaries?
Not much. I think they phoned them in, and there are a couple of little interesting tidbits, but a lot of it was, well, okay, here we are walking, and and then we get on horses, and okay, they corroborate the Ringo horse runaway story. Ringo's comment about the drum size changing in Hello Goodbye is kind of interesting, but and Paul's commentary about the strange guy in the Hey Jude video, at least, so now we know who he is and why he was there. But beyond that, there wasn't a lot of information. They were basically telling us what we could see by just watching it.
Right. I thought the Paul commentaries were better than Ringo's. I think Ringo's really were just kind of window dressing, basically, and Paul actually, like you say, he said some stuff that actually was interesting, and even if the observations were what they were, at least Paul, there was enough of what Paul had to say that you could kind of gather some, I don't know, some feelings about what he was, how he felt about them, where Ringo didn't say a whole lot about anything,
Yeah, but some of Ringo's were a little funny, funny asides, like, okay, we're going to get another wear out of those Sgt. Pepper costumes, and it caught a bit of his sense of humor, I thought. So, yeah, the commentaries. I mean, I don't imagine I'll really watch those again. To any of you, apart from the one time you watched them, is there any reason to go back?
No, I wish they had done actually a few more.
Yeah. Yeah, and taken it more seriously, maybe, But
I found the bit about Strawberry Fields to be interesting because Paul was talking about how the Beatles at the time liked Swedish films,
right? That's
and very
true.
artsy films, and Peter Goldman, I guess that's the name of the director for Strawberry Fields. He he led them in that direction into making something very artsy, and he had very definite ideas of what he wanted the band to do, and it was all done in one day. And they do talk a little bit in detail about that, mainly Paul. But I found that to be interesting. I never knew that before.
So
Ringo said that it was Paul's idea that he would jump up to the tree.
But then Paul said the director told him to do it, so there was some contradiction going on too. So.
memories
like
fade.
Yeah. Right. I just think also, just watching a lot of things. I mean, as you're watching, we were talking before about the interaction between them, but you think of other things too, just as you see these clips, like the fact that when they did the Yesterday performance on Ed Sullivan, nobody in America would have even known Yesterday at the time. It had come out on the British Help album. Yeah. It wasn't out as a single yet, and I don't think by the time it was even broadcast, perhaps, but maybe it come out.
That was the day before.
Yeah, but the studio audience must have had no idea what that was all about, and that must have been great. Sitting there and hearing live a Beatles song you've never heard before, and it's Yesterday. Just an incredible thing.
We've talked about that before because there have been several instances of that. I mean, recently when Dave Schwensen was the guest on our show, and he brought up the fact that when the Beatles played at Shea, they did Act Naturally, which hadn't been released here yet.
That's right.
Same thing with the Washington Coliseum show. with Roll Over Beethoven
Uh-huh.
being the first song, and
Long Tall Sally.
Long Tall Sally. Thank you, Al.
Yeah.
Right.
So that certainly wasn't the first time that happened.
That's right. Yeah.
So Beatles were full of surprises for us.
That's right.
One thing about the Alan, you were talking about the interaction. It's fun just to watch, to focus in on each of them. Not their interaction, but just what they do. I'm watching Hello Goodbye right now, and watching them all kind of play around. Ringo shaking his head. It actually looks like he's a little tired, but I love the part at the end where the girls are dancing with John, and John kind of leers over at the camera with this kind of snarky smile on his face, like, "Ha, look at me! Don't you wish you were here?"
Yeah.
And there's that moment in Hey Jude. I think the version that's on the first disc, where you can tell Paul keeps glancing over at John, and you can tell that he's either making faces or doing something. And finally, at one point, almost near the end of the first part of the song, Paul has to sort of just lower his head to keep from cracking up entirely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the funny thing is that if you think there's been all the talk all these years about the the White Album being the tension, the beginning of all the tensions, and yet right in the middle of those sessions you have a moment like that.
Right.
Which shows that they were still that that bond,
Right.
that interaction.
Oh yeah.
But they were also four very individual personalities, and
absolutely
their personalities. I mean, that was what everybody fell in love with, and you can see that really to the nth degree on these videos. Why individually, why everybody loved John, why everybody loved George. Ringo's humor, and Paul, of course. I like what you said, Alan, about Paul being on all the time. That's extremely true. Extremely true.
Yeah.
So,
guys, we can be talking about this all night, and there's just so much material here. But I think the bottom line is, I think we all think this is a great release. We may have feelings about this or that flaw, but good work, Apple. And so for this week, that is Things We Said Today. If you want to email us, write to us at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. And you can find us on Twitter at the @ThingsWeSaidFab. And otherwise, we will see you next week. So for Ken Michaels, Steve Marinucci, and Al Sussman, I'm Alan Kozin, and we'll see you next time.